Over 900 people died, not because of war, but because they trusted one man. If you were to stand in the clearing of the Guyanese jungle on November 19, 1978, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the sight. It would be the silence. A silence so heavy, so unnatural, that it felt like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. Just days before, this place had been filled with the chaotic sounds of life: chickens clucking near the coops, children playing basketball on the dirt court, the hum of a diesel generator, and the constant, booming voice of a man over the loudspeakers. Now, the only sound was the wind rusting through the canopy and the buzzing of flies. On the ground, lying face down in the dirt, were the bodies of teachers, nurses, carpenters, and babies. They were not soldiers. They were not criminals. They were idealists who wanted to build a heaven on earth, and instead, they found themselves in a hell made of their own devotion. Over 900 people died here, not because of war, not because of a natural disaster, but because they trusted one man. To understand how a tragedy of this magnitude happens, you cannot simply start with the bodies in the jungle. You have to go back. Back before the cyanide, back before the guns, back to the desperate hunger for belonging that exists in the human heart. You have to look at how a master manipulator named James Warren Jones learned to feed that hunger with poisoned bread. This is not a story of sudden madness. It is a chronicle of a slow, methodical dismantling of the human will, a roadmap of how the promise of a utopia was twisted, screw by screw, into a cage of terror. It begins in the dust of the American Midwest and ends in the silence of the South American rainforest, and at every step, the victims did not see a monster. The story truly begins in the 1950s, in Indianapolis. This was a city rigidly divided by color lines, a reflection of a fractured America. African Americans lived in one world, whites in another, and never the twain should meet. Into this landscape stepped Jim Jones, a man who seemed to possess a spiritual gravity that pulled the marginalized toward him. He was not merely a preacher. He was a performance artist of the soul. Even as a child, he was different. He was obsessed with religion and death, conducting elaborate funerals for small animals in his backyard, a strange little boy who commanded the attention of his playmates with a mixture of charisma and intense, unblinking focus. Jones understood early on that to catch people, you had to offer them what the world denied them: dignity, health, and purpose. He didn't just want a congregation, he wanted a movement. And to build a movement, he needed power. He had observed the revival circuits, watching faith healers work crowds into frenzies, and in those sweaty, shouting tents, he saw not the power of God, but the power of theater. He realized that healings could attract people and, crucially, generate the income necessary to fund his social goals. So, the miracles began. Picture a crowded church hall in Indiana. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of sawdust. The organ is humming, a low vibration that you feel in your chest. Jones stands at the pulpit, wearing dark sunglasses even indoors, his voice booming with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. He points a finger into the crowd. "You," he shouts. "You there, in the back. You're in pain, aren't you?" An elderly woman stands up, trembling. She nods. "She has cancer," she says. "The doctors have given up." Jones calls her forward. The room goes silent. He lays his hands on her, his face contorted in concentration. And then, in a dramatic climax, he pulls his hand away and holds something up for the crowd to see. A bloody, fleshy mass. "The cancer is out!" he screams. The crowd weeps. They cheer. They rush the altar. They have just witnessed the divine. But they haven't. What they have witnessed is a sleight of hand, a parlor trick performed with chicken livers or animal tissue palmed by Jones or one of his confederates. It was a lie. A grotesque, bloody lie. But the relief on the woman's face was real. The hope in the room was real. And that was the first hook. This manipulation wasn't just for profit. It established Jones not just as a leader, but as a conduit to the supernatural. He was building a reservoir of blind faith that he would draw upon later, when the requests became darker. But here is where the story gets complicated, and where the trap becomes truly dangerous. If Jones had been a simple conman, people might have seen through him eventually. But he wasn't just selling fake miracles. He was offering something real alongside the poison. In 1956, he founded the People's Temple Full Gospel Church, buying his first building in a racially mixed neighborhood. At a time when segregation was the law of the land, Jones's church was aggressively integrated. He didn't just talk about equality, he lived it. He preached a radical message of racial justice. He established soup kitchens, nursing homes, and employment bureaus. Imagine you are an African-American mother in 1950s Indiana. You can't eat at certain lunch counters. You can't try on clothes in department stores. And then you walk into People's Temple, and this white preacher hugs you. He tells you that you are valuable. He tells you that God doesn't see color. He gives you a job. For the first time in your life, you feel seen. That feeling is intoxicating. It is more powerful than any feeling. You would do anything for the man who gave it to you. The Cordell family, for instance, didn't walk into the church looking for salvation. They were looking for a pet. Edith Cordell had lost a monkey, a beloved family pet, and she saw an advertisement Jones had placed in the newspaper. He was selling monkeys to raise funds for the church. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? A church selling monkeys. But it was a classic tactic. Jones met people at their point of need or interest. Maybe you needed a healing. Maybe you needed a community. Maybe you just wanted a monkey. It didn't matter how you came in. What mattered was that once you were in, the doors began to close, very softly, behind you. The Cordells went for the pet, and they stayed for the message. And years later, members of that family would die in a jungle thousands of miles away, all because of that initial, innocuous entry point. As the 1960s rolled on, Jones's ambition grew, but so did his paranoia. He had become interested in communism, a dangerous obsession during the height of the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. He felt targeted. He felt persecuted. And because he was the leader, he made his followers feel persecuted too. He taught them that the world outside, the government, the media, the racists, was hostile. He taught them that they were a chosen remnant, the only people who really got it. Then, he dropped the ultimate fear tactic: the bomb. By the early 1960s, Jones began prophesying a nuclear apocalypse. He claimed he had received visions that Indianapolis would be destroyed by a nuclear strike. He told his flock that they were in imminent danger. Imagine sitting in the pews, listening to this man who healed your cancer, this man who gave you dignity, telling you that fire was going to rain from the sky. He told them they needed to go to a place of safety, a holy remnant, that would survive the coming fire. The hook was set. They were no longer just a church, they were a survival strategy. And the only way to survive was to trust the man who saw the future. In 1965, the migration began. Jones led approximately 140 of his most loyal followers away from Indiana. They packed their cars, sold their homes, and said goodbye to their skeptics. They were heading to Ukiah, California, in the Redwood Valley. Why Ukiah? Because Jones had read a magazine article that listed it as one of the safest places in the United States in the event of a nuclear war. This move was the first great filter. Think about it. It's one thing to go to church on Sunday. It's another thing entirely to quit your job, sell your house, and move across the country because your pastor says the world is ending. The people who went to California were the true believers. They were the ones who had severed their ties with reality and replaced it with Jones's reality. In California, the perfect community began to take shape, and with it, the tightening of control. The temple expanded. It wasn't just a rural outpost anymore. It moved into San Francisco and Los Angeles. It became a formidable political machine. Jones realized that he could trade his followers' obedience for political power. He could snap his fingers, and hundreds of obedient, well-dressed, diverse members would flood a political rally, cheering on command. Politicians loved him. He was courted by the elite. He helped elect George Moscone as mayor of San Francisco in 1975. In return, Jones was appointed chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. He was a VIP. He stood on stages with Governor Jerry Brown. He hosted the First Lady's entourage. To his followers, this was proof. See? The world respects Dad. Dad is powerful. But inside the temple, Dad is the right. Atmosphere was shifting. That apostolic socialism Jones preached required total sacrifice. It started small. Tithing 10%. Then 20%. Then, members were encouraged to sign over their entire property. Their homes. Their paychecks. Even the custody of their children. The community became a devourer of resources and identities. And then came the punishments. They were called catharsis sessions. It sounds therapeutic, doesn't it? But it was a nightmare. Public meetings where members were forced to stand up and confess their sins. And these weren't just sins against God, they were sins against Jones. I thought about leaving, someone might admit. Or, I thought Dad looked tired. For these transgressions, they were subjected to humiliation. They were screamed at by the congregation. And then, the physical beatings began. Adults being paddled in front of their children. Children being beaten in front of their parents. Why did they stay? Why didn't they just walk out the door? Because by then, they had no money. They had no homes to go back to. Their families were in the church. And Jones had convinced them that the world outside was full of racists and fascists who wanted to destroy them. The church was a prison, yes, but Jones convinced them it was a fortress. Jones himself was deteriorating. The pressure of maintaining the illusion was crushing him. He began relying on drugs. Amphetamines to fuel his manic work schedule, to keep him preaching and planning for days without sleep. And then barbiturates to bring him down when the edge got too sharp. He started wearing dark sunglasses indoors, all the time, to hide his eyes, pupils pinned from uppers or dilated from downers. To his followers, it just added to his mystique. He was inscrutable. He was powerful. But you can't keep a secret like this forever. The cracks in the facade appeared and the journalists began to dig. They heard whispers of fraud, of beatings, of people being held against their will. Former members, defectors like Grace Stone and her husband Tim Stone, began to speak out. The Stones were a particular threat. Tim Stone had been an insider, a lawyer for the temple. He knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively for now. In the summer of 1977, word reached Jones that an exposé was about to be published in New West magazine. The article was going to detail everything, the fake miracles, the beatings, the financial fraud. Jones panicked. He felt the walls closing in. He decided it was time to pull the ripcord. He enacted a contingency plan he had been preparing for years. The move to Guyana. Overnight, the temple mobilized. It was a frantic exodus. Hundreds of members were flown to South America, to a leased tract of jungle near the Venezuelan border. They were told they were fleeing the persecution of the press. They were told they were going to the Promised Land. Jones left the same night the article was read to him over the phone. Imagine the disorientation. You are a city dweller from San Francisco. You get on a plane, and suddenly you are in the middle of a dense, steaming rainforest. The isolation was no longer metaphorical. It was geographic and absolute. There were no phones. There was no television. There was only the jungle, and there was only Dad. Jonestown was sold to the followers as a socialist utopia. Brochures showed happy children eating fresh fruit, people working in harmony with nature. But the reality was a brutal labor camp. The soil was poor, the heat was suffocating, and the bugs were relentless. The food was the first shock. The diet was insufficient for the hard labor required to clear the jungle. Breakfast was often just rice. Lunch was rice water soup. Dinner was rice and beans, reserved for the inner circle or special occasions. On Sundays, if they were lucky, residents might receive an egg and a cookie. The work days stretched from 6:30 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. Elderly women, urban professionals who had never held a shovel in their lives, were forced to toil in the fields to grow cassava and bananas. And through it all, there was the voice. There was no silence in Jonestown. Jones's voice boomed over the loudspeaker system 24 hours a day. He sat in his cabin, high on drugs, reading news to the camp. But it wasn't real news. He edited it. He fabricated it. He told them that the United States had collapsed into chaos. He told them that African Americans were being herded into concentration camps. He told them that the KKK was marching in the streets. "We are the last free people on earth," he would rumble over the speakers. "They are coming for us. They want to destroy us because we are free." This constant auditory barrage prevented clear wooden crate, sometimes buried underground or placed in the blazing hot sun. A person would be locked inside for days, unable to stand or stretch, deprived of light, sometimes taunted by Jones's voice piped in, or left in terrified silence. For children who misbehaved, there were terrors like being lowered into a dark well at night, where they were told monsters lurked. But the ultimate mechanism of control, the thing that truly prepared them for the end, was the White Night. A white night was a crisis drill. Jones would wake the entire community in the dead of night. The sirens would wail across the jungle compound, terrifying and loud. "Alert! Alert!" he would scream. "We are under attack!" He would gather all 900 of them in the central pavilion. He would tell them that the enemy was closing in. The CIA, the mercenaries, the Guyanese army, it didn't matter who. He would tell them that the enemy was going to come in and torture their children, rape the women, and kill the men. He told them that the only honorable option left was revolutionary suicide. In these drills, residents were lined up. They were given small cups of red liquid. They were told it was poison. They were told that they would die in 45 minutes. Imagine standing there, holding a cup of punch, believing it will kill you. Looking at your child and believing you are saving them from torture by giving it to them. They drank it. They waited to die. They cried. They held their families. They made their peace. And then, nothing happened. 45 minutes would pass. Jones would watch them, testing their loyalty. And when they didn't die, he would announce that it was a test. "I was testing you," he would proclaim. "You have passed. You are loyal." These rehearsals were diabolical. They were desensitization training. He was teaching them that their lives belonged to him. 1978, the sound of a small plane engine cut through the humidity of the Guyanese sky. Inside the Twin Otter aircraft sat Congressman Leo Ryan, a man known for his flair for the dramatic and his refusal to take no for an answer. With him were journalists from NBC, The Washington Post, and the San Francisco Examiner, along with a group of terrified but determined relatives. They had come to see if the rumors were true. Was Jonestown a utopia, or was it a concentration camp? Jim Jones had tried everything to stop them. He had his lawyers threaten lawsuits. He had his members flood the embassy with letters. He had stalled them in the capital of Georgetown for days. But Ryan had come anyway. When the plane touched down on the red dirt of the Port Kaituma airstrip, 6 miles from the settlement, the air was thick with tension. A dump truck from the temple was waiting for them, but the welcome was cold. A local police officer, Corporal Rudder, warned the group that he couldn't guarantee their safety. The ride from the airstrip to Jonestown was a journey into the heart of darkness. The truck bounced over rutted, muddy roads, deeper and deeper into the bush. When they finally arrived at the gate, they were met not by open arms, but by a chain across the road and a guardhouse. For a moment, it seemed they would be turned back. But Jones, realizing that turning away a U.S. congressman would bring the wrath of the American government down upon him, had made a calculated decision. He would let them in. He would show them the paradise. He would put on the greatest performance of the compound. The sun was setting. The delegation stepped out into a surreal scene. The settlement was immaculate. The walkways were swept. The members were dressed in their Sunday best, bright colors against the green of the jungle. They were smiling. They were singing. It looked, for all the world, like a happy, thriving village. Jones himself appeared, wearing a casual shirt and his trademark sunglasses. He played the part of the benevolent, misunderstood father. He shook hands with Ryan. He joked with the reporters. He offered them dinner, smoked pork and greens, a feast compared to the rice water the residents usually ate. That night, they held a reception in the central pavilion. This was the same open-air structure where Jones usually conducted his White Night terror drills, but tonight it was a concert hall. The Jonestown Express, the community's funk and soul band, took the stage. They were incredibly talented musicians who had given up careers in the States to follow Jones. They played upbeat, soulful numbers. The elderly members clapped their hands. The children danced. The energy was electric. Congressman Ryan watched it all, soaking it in. He was a politician, and he knew how to read a crowd, but he was being jammed. The love bombing was intense. Finally, he took the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, black, white, old, young, and he spoke the words that Jones had been desperate to hear. "I can tell you right now," Ryan said, his voice echoing over the loudspeakers, "that from the few conversations I've had with some of the folks here, there are some people who believe this is the best thing that ever happened to their whole life." Thunderous applause. Cheers. People stood up and screamed their approval. Jones sat off to the side, clapping, a tight smile on his face. It seemed to work. The congressman was buying it. The reporters were filming smiling faces. The lie was holding. But the jungle has eyes, and the silence has a voice. While the band played and the people cheered, the cracks began to show. A young man named Vernon Gosney, his face pale and sweating in the heat, made his move. He saw Don Harris, the NBC correspondent, standing near the edge of the crowd. Gosney bumped into him, acting casual, and slipped a small, folded piece of paper into Harris's hand. He whispered a single word: "Help." Harris didn't look at it immediately. He put it in his pocket. Later, in the privacy of his quarters, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in blue ink on a scrap of notebook paper. It read, "Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, please help us get out of Jonestown." It was the puncture wound that deflated the entire illusion. That tiny scrap of paper proved that the smiles were masks. It proved that the applause was coerced. It proved that Jonestown was a prison. The next morning, November 18th, the atmosphere had shifted. The rain clouds were gathering, heavy and gray. The joy of the previous night had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating dread. Ryan and the journalists began to interview people, specifically asking for the individuals named in the note. The dam broke. It wasn't just Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby. The Parks family, patricians of the church, stepped forward. Then the Bogue family. They didn't just want to talk, they wanted to leave. They were packing their bags, watching his world dissolve. He looked small, slumped in his chair. He had taken off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were dull and red-rimmed from drugs and lack of sleep. "I have failed," he muttered to the reporters, his voice trembling with self-pity. "I live for my people because I don't know nothing else to do." He turned to the defectors, pleading with them. "Why do you want to leave? This is the best damn family you'll ever have. You'll be back. They'll chew you up out there." But they weren't listening. They were terrified. They grabbed their meager belongings, suitcases tied with rope, plastic bags filled with clothes, and huddled around the congressman. The hook no longer held them. They had seen the exit, and they were running for it. As the group prepared to load onto the dump truck for the ride back to the airstrip, the violence finally spilled over. A temple loyalist named Don Sly, a man known for his blind devotion, lunged at Congressman Ryan with a knife. The blade flashed in the gray light. Ryan fell back, startled. Lawyers Charles Gary and Mark Lane wrestled Sly to the ground, the knife skittering across the floor. Ryan was unhurt, but the message was clear: you are not leaving here. Jones watched the scuffle without moving. "Does this change everything?" Ryan asked, brushing the dirt off his clothes. He was shaken, blood on his shirt from the struggle, though not his own. He looked at Jones. "I still think we can file a positive report," he said, perhaps trying to de-escalate, perhaps simply naive. "We'll just say it was an isolated incident." Jones didn't answer. He knew it was over. The defectors were leaving. The congressman had been attacked. The press had the story. The community was exposed. Now numbering about 30 people, including the defectors, scrambled onto the truck. The mood was hysterical. They knew they were escaping a powder keg that had already been lit. The truck rumbled out of the compound, the wheels churning up the red mud. As they looked back, they saw the guards at the gate watching them, stone-faced. They thought they were safe. They thought the nightmare was behind them. They arrived at the Port Kaituma airstrip in the mid-afternoon. 2 planes were waiting for them, a 6-seater Cessna and a larger Twin Otter. The group began to board, prioritizing the defectors and the journalists. NBC cameraman Bob Brown hoisted his heavy camera onto his shoulder, filming the chaotic scene. The propellers began to spin, whipping up the wind. Back at the compound, Jones had made his decision. He could not let the congressman leave. If Ryan returned to the U.S. with stories of the knife attack and the defectors, the temple was finished. The investigations would be endless. The custody of the children would be lost. Jones called his security force, the Red Brigade. "Go," he told them. "Do what you have to do." As the passengers were loading onto the planes, a tractor pulling a flatbed trailer appeared at the edge of the airstrip. It was a vehicle from the temple. It drove slowly across the tarmac, cutting off the path of the planes. It stopped about 30 feet away. The people on the plane looked out the windows. "Who is that?" someone asked. Men jumped out from the trailer. They were not smiling. They were not singing. They were armed with shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Among them were Tom Keiss and Joe Wilson, Jones's most trusted enforcers. They didn't hesitate. They raised their weapons. They didn't shout a warning. They simply opened fire. The sound was deafening. Bullets ripped through the aluminum skin of the airplanes. Glass shattered. Tires exploded. Congressman Leo Ryan, standing near the Twin Otter, was hit first. He crumpled to the tarmac. The gunmen advanced, walking calmly, methodically. They walked up to the congressman, who was lying on the ground, and shot him point blank. They shot him more than 20 times, ensuring he was dead. They wanted to make a statement. Don Harris, the reporter who had taken the note, was gunned down. Greg Robinson, the photographer for the San Francisco Examiner, was killed while trying to take a picture of his attackers. Patricia Parks, one of the defectors who had just minutes ago believed she was free, was shot in the head inside the plane. And then there was Bob Brown, the NBC cameraman. Even as the bullets flew, even as the gunman walked toward him, he kept his camera rolling. He was a journalist to the very end. The footage he captured, shaky, chaotic, terrifying, shows the men approaching, weapons raised. Then the camera drops to the ground. The filming stops. Bob Brown was dead. Inside the smaller Cessna, the horror was different. A Trojan horse, defector named Larry Layton, a man who had pretended to want to leave just to get on the plane, pulled out a snub-nosed .38 revolver. He was sitting inside the crowded cabin. He turned and fired at the people sitting next to him, wounding Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby. The plane became a cage of screaming, bleeding people until another passenger managed to wrestle the gun for a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the tractor rumbled away, leaving the airstrip silent again, 5 people lay dead. Many others were wounded, bleeding into the tarmac. The survivors, including Ryan's aide Jackie Spear, who had been shot 5 times, dragged themselves into the tall elephant grass surrounding the runway. They lay there, terrified, playing dead, listening to the insects buzzing, waiting for the gunmen to come back. But the gunmen didn't come back. They had a new destination. They were heading back to Jonestown. Back to the pavilion. Back to Dad. While the slaughter was happening at the airstrip, the loudspeakers in Jonestown crackled to life. The siren wailed a sound every resident knew in their bones. It was the white knight signal. But this time, Jones's voice didn't sound manic or angry. It sounded resigned. It sounded dead. "Alert," he said. "Alert. Everyone to the pavilion." They came from the cottages. They came from the fields. Mothers carried babies. Old men hobbled on canes. The Red Brigade surrounded the structure, crossbows and rifles in hand. There was no leaving now. The jungle was no longer a wall, it was a tomb. Jones sat on his raised platform, the throne, from which he had dispensed healing and justice. He told them what had happened. He told them that the congressman was dead. He lied to them one last time. He told them that the Guyanese Defense Force would be there in minutes. He spun a graphic, terrifying fantasy. "They'll shoot some of our innocent babies," he warned. "They'll torture our children. They'll torture our seniors." He told them there was no escape. No road to Russia. No future. The only way to defeat the enemy was to deny them their victory. The only way to win was to die. "We must die with some dignity," he urged, his voice slurring slightly. "We must die with some dignity." The vat was brought forward. A metal tub, usually used for mixing feed or laundry. It was filled with a dark purple liquid flavor aid. Dr. Larry Schacht, the camp physician who had once sworn to save lives, had prepared the cocktail. He had mixed the fruit punch with potassium cyanide, Valium to calm the panic, and chloral hydrate to speed the absorption. It was a chemistry of death, designed to kill quickly, but not painlessly. The guards stood ready. The nurses stood ready with syringes. The sun was going down, casting long shadows over the assembly. The perfect community was about to commit the ultimate act of unity. And then, a single voice rose from the crowd. A woman stood up. Her name was Christine Miller. She was trembling, but she was standing. She looked at Jones, the man she had worshipped, and she said, "The pavilion was a cavern of noise and fear." But one voice cut through the din. Christine Miller, a 60-year-old African-American woman, stood near the front. In a community trained to nod and agree, she was doing the unthinkable. She was arguing with God. "I look at all the babies and I think they deserve to live," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She held the microphone, facing Jim Jones. The tape recorder captured this desperate negotiation. She argued that suicide was defeat. She argued that they should attempt an airlift to Russia, a plan Jones had dangled before them for months. "I think that we all have a right to our own destiny as individuals," she pleaded. Jones looked at her with a terrifying calmness. He was not screaming. He was speaking like a disappointed schoolteacher. "I agree," he said smoothly. "But we have no right to our own destiny. The congressman has been murdered." He used the violence at the airstrip, violence he had ordered as the lock on their cage. He told them the GDF, Guyanese Defense Force, would be there any minute to parachute in and kill them all. He told them there was no road to Russia anymore. Miller tried again. "I'm not afraid to die," she said. "But I look at the babies." And then, the most heartbreaking thing happened. The crowd turned on her. Years of conditioning, of sleep deprivation, of us versus them mentality kicked in. Other members began to shout her down. "Sit down," they yelled. "You're disrupting the unity. You're afraid to die." They were so terrified of the outside world, so desperate to please Dad, that they policed their own destruction. Under the weight of 900 voices, Christine Miller's resistance collapsed. She sat down. Jones turned. She would die with the rest. "Bring the medication," he commanded. It wasn't medication. It was a metal vat brought from the kitchen, filled with a dark purple liquid. It was Flavor Aid, a cheap knockoff of Kool-Aid mixed with water, copious amounts of sugar to mask the bitterness, and a lethal cocktail prepared by Dr. Larry Schacht. Schacht, the camp doctor who had sworn an oath to save lives, had researched cyanide toxicity for months. He had mixed potassium cyanide with Valium to sedate the victims and chloral hydrate to speed up the absorption. "Bring the babies first," Jones said. This was the final, strategic cruelty. Jones knew that if the adults drank first, they might hesitate when the pain started. But if the children died first, the parents would have nothing left to live for. The nurses and caregivers moved into the crowd. They carried syringes, not with needles, but oral syringes to squirt the liquid into the mouths of infants who were too young to hold a cup. The death tape records the sounds that followed. It was not the peaceful transition Jones had promised. Cyanide is a caustic poison. It burns the throat. It shuts down the body's ability to use oxygen, causing cellular asphyxiation. It causes foaming at the mouth, convulsions, and intense pain. Mothers began to scream. Children began to cry. The pavilion filled with the sounds of wailing. Jones, sitting on his throne, grew impatient. "Stop this hysterics," he scolded over the microphone, his voice slurring. "This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity." He treated their agony as a lack of discipline. Adults, I call on you to stop this nonsense," he said. "I call on you to quit exciting your children when all they're doing is going to a quiet rest." The adults began to line up. The Red Brigade guards stood in a ring around the pavilion, facing inward. They held rifles and crossbows. The message was clear: you can drink the poison, or you can take a bullet. Some drank with fanatical willingness, stepping over the bodies of their own children to take the cup, believing they were making a revolutionary statement. Others were coerced, held down by guards while nurses injected the poison down their throats. Families lay down together, arms around each other, face down in the dirt. They died holding hands. In the midst of this industrial-scale slaughter, a handful of people found the cracks in the prison wall. They were the ones who saw the monster instead of the father. Odell Rhodes, a Vietnam veteran and the community's arts and crafts teacher, kept his wits about him. He saw the babies dying and knew this wasn't a drill. He signaled to a nurse. "I need to get a stethoscope," he said, pointing to the medical building. "To check the pulse." It was a ruse. He slipped past the perimeter, hid under a building until nightfall, and then fled into the jungle. Stanley Clayton, a cook, watched the horror unfold. "That man was killing us," he later said. He saw people convulsing. He saw the foam on their lips. He waited until the guards were distracted by the chaos of so many dying people. He tricked them by acting as if he was searching for missing children, edging closer to the tree line. Then he bolted. He ran into the bush, the sounds of Jones's voice fading behind him. Tim and Mike Carter, high-ranking members of the temple, were given a bizarre final mission. Jones called them forward and handed them heavy suitcases. "Take these to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown," he ordered. The suitcases contained over $500,000 in cash and gold. Jones wanted his legacy to go to the Communist Party. The Carter brothers, realizing this was their ticket out, took the Soviet embassy in Georgetown, he ordered. The suitcases contained over $500,000 in cash and gold. Jones wanted his legacy to go to the Communist Party. The Carter brothers, realizing this was their ticket out, took the suitcases. They walked out of the pavilion, leaving their wives and children behind to die. Once they hit the jungle, they dumped the money and ran for their lives. And then there was Hyacinth Thrash, an elderly African-American woman. She had been in her cottage when the siren wailed. She was tired. She didn't want to go to another meeting. She hid under her bed. She heard the gunshots from the perimeter. She heard the screaming. And then, she heard the silence. She stayed under that bed all night, terrified. When she woke up the next morning, the sun was shining. She walked out into the compound. She saw the birds flying. She saw the chickens. And then she saw the bodies. Hundreds of them, covering the ground like a colorful carpet of death. I said, "Oh God, they came and they killed them all, and I's the onlyest one alive," she cried. She was the only survivor found inside the camp when the troops arrived. Back in the pavilion, the noise had stopped. Jones was one of the last to die. He did not drink the poison. He did not suffer the convulsions. He took the coward's way out. He was found with a gunshot wound to the left temple. A pistol lay near his body. Whether he pulled the trigger himself or ordered a nurse to do it, we will never know. But he died surrounded by the family he had destroyed. Nearby lay Carolyn Layton, his mistress and second in command. She had helped plan this mass murder. She had written the orders. She was found dead from poison. In her pocket was a note, her last will and testament, witnessing the depth of her indoctrination. I hereby leave all assets to the Communist Party of the USSR. She was trying to prove her loyalty to a cause that had long since been forgotten by the man she loved. The horror wasn't limited to Jonestown. In the temple's headquarters in Georgetown, 150 miles away, Jones's order was received over the radio. Sharon Amos, a fierce loyalist, took a kitchen knife. She took her 3 children into the bathroom. She killed them, one by one, and then slashed her own throat. However, not everyone obeyed. The temple's basketball team, including Jones's own son, Jim Jones Jr., was in Georgetown for a tournament. They were young, athletic, and miles away from the hypnotic voice on the loudspeaker. When the order came over the radio to commit revolutionary suicide, they refused. They chose life. They were the ones who would have to live with the legacy of their name. When the Guyanese Defense Force finally secured Jonestown on November 19th, they found a silent city of the dead. The initial body count was estimated at 400. But as the soldiers began to move the remains, they realized the horror was deeper than they thought. Parents had fallen on top of their children. The bodies were stacked layers deep. The final count was 918. The bodies were eventually repatriated to the United States. Many were buried in a mass grave at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California. They were unclaimed. Their families were too ashamed, too angry, or simply dead alongside them. The Jonestown Massacre left a scar on the global consciousness. It introduced the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," into our language, a trivializing euphemism for a horrific reality. But if you listen to the story, if you really hear it, you realize that the people who died were not fools. They were not crazy. They were teachers, nurses, social workers, and idealists. They were people who wanted to build a world without racism, without poverty, without hate. They were betrayed. They were betrayed not by their ideals, but by the hook until the very end. He convinced them that the world was burning, and he was the only firefighter. He convinced them that the only way to save their lives was to lose them. He convinced them that the poison was a potion of liberation. The jungle has since reclaimed the site. The pavilion is gone, consumed by vines and rot. The cottages have fallen. But the lesson remains stark and terrifying. Blind belief is more dangerous than any weapon. It can turn a father into a monster, a community into a graveyard, and a cup of fruit punch into a weapon of mass destruction. Was settling over Jonestown, a different kind of horror was unfolding 6 miles away at the Port Kaituma airstrip. The tractor and the gunman had left, rumbling back into the darkness to join their leader in his final act, but the survivors on the tarmac didn't know that. They lay in the dirt, bleeding, terrified, and waiting. Among them was Jackie Spear, the congressman's aide. She had been shot 5 times. Her arm was shattered, the bone protruding, her leg devastated. She lay on an anthill, the biting insects swarming her wounds, but she didn't dare move. She played dead, listening to the labored breathing of the others. Near her lay the body of her boss, Leo Ryan, the first U.S. congressman ever assassinated in the line of duty. As night fell, the jungle came alive with sounds, crickets, frogs, the rustle of leaves. To the survivors, every snap of a twig sounded like the gunman returning to finish the job. They dragged themselves into the tall, sharp elephant grass at the edge of the runway. They had no medical supplies. They had no radio. They were bleeding out in the middle of nowhere. The pilot of the small Cessna, who had managed to escape the shooting, had flown the uninjured to the capital, promising to send help. But help in Guyana is measured in days, not minutes. The survivors found a bottle of rum in the duty-free bag of one of the victims. They passed it around in the dark, taking sips to dull the pain of bullet wounds and the shock of seeing their friends executed. They lay there for 19 hours. 19 hours of staring at the stars, wondering if the man they had come to investigate, the man who called himself Dad, was coming back to kill them. The few who had slipped away from the pavilion were fighting their own battle for survival. Odell Rhodes, the teacher who had volunteered to fetch a stethoscope, was now cowering under the wooden stilts of a cottage. He could hear the babies crying. Then he heard the mother screaming. And then he heard the applause. That was the most chilling part, the applause. Jones was thanking them for their bravery, for their revolutionary suicide. And the people were clapping as their families died. When the noise finally stopped, Rhodes crawled on his belly toward the perimeter. He knew the Red Brigade had patrols. He moved inch by inch through the mud, expecting a flashlight beam or a bullet at any second. He eventually met up with another survivor, Stanley Clayton. Clayton had watched people foam at the mouth and die. He had seen the life drain from the eyes of friends he had known for years. He had tricked the guards by pretending to look for lost children, then bolted into the bush. Together, they plunged into the dense rainforest. It was pitch black. The jungle floor was a tangle of roots and vines that tripped them and tore at their clothes. They didn't know where they were going. They only knew they had to get away from the smell of almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide that was drifting on the wind. They huddled together, shivering, listening to the jungle, terrified that the silence from the camp meant that the killers were now coming for them. Meanwhile, Tim and Mike Carter, the brothers sent away with the suitcases of money, were having their own reckoning. They had dumped the heavy luggage, $500,000 in useless cash, into the undergrowth. They were sitting in the dark, sobbing. They had left their wives. They had left their children. They had chosen to live, and the weight of that choice was crushing them. At one point, Tim Carter fell to his knees and vomited. He wanted to go back. But he wanted to die with his son. That primal drive that Jones had tried so hard to extinguish pushed him forward. They kept moving, aimlessly, just to put distance between themselves. The sun rose on November 19, 1978, over a scene that defied comprehension. The Guyanese Defense Force soldiers, alerted by the pilot who had escaped, finally arrived at the gate of Jonestown. They approached with caution, weapons drawn, expecting a firefight with a heavily armed militia. Instead, they found a ghost town. As they walked past the perimeter fence, the first thing they saw was the pavilion. From a distance, it looked like a colorful quilt had been thrown over the ground. Bright reds, blues, greens, and yellows. As they got closer, the quilt resolved into individual shapes. Bodies. Hundreds of them. They were packed so tightly together that you couldn't see the ground. Jones had ordered them to lie down in neat rows. Families were huddled together in death embraces. Husbands holding wives. Mothers clutching infants. The soldiers, hardened men who had seen jungle warfare, covered their mouths. The smell was already rising in the tropical heat, a sickly sweet mixture of rot, excrement, and the faint, lingering odor of fruit punch. At first, the soldiers estimated the dead at around 400. They walked through the camp, checking buildings. They found the bodies of Jones and his inner circle in the pavilion. They found the dead dogs, killed by the guards before they killed themselves. They found Mr. Muggs, the chimpanzee, shot in his cage. Jones had wanted nothing to survive. But as the cleanup began days later, the true scale of the massacre was revealed. The initial count was wrong. The bodies weren't just lying side by side, they were stacked. Children were buried underneath adults. Infants were hidden under the bodies of their mothers. As the soldiers began to lift the remains, the count rose. 400 became 500. Then 700. Then 900. The final count was 918 men, while the soldiers women, were counting the children. A surreal scene was playing out in Georgetown, the capital city. The Temple's basketball team, the pride of the community, was there for a tournament. They were young, athletic men, including Jones's own son, Stephen Jones. They had been miles away from the poison, safe in their hotel rooms. When the news broke, they were paralyzed. They gathered around a radio, listening to the reports. Mass suicide. Congressman dead. Everyone gone. Imagine being Stephen Jones in that moment. You are 19 years old. Your father, the man you loved and hated, the man who claimed to be God, has just murdered everyone you know. Your mother is dead. Your brothers and sisters are dead. Your friends are dead. And you are alive because you were playing a game. The survivors in Georgetown were gathered by the police. The mood was a mix of devastating grief and furious anger. They realized then that they were the residue, that Jones had spoken of the ones left behind to tell the story. But what story would they tell? Jones had wanted them to tell the world that this was a noble act of revolutionary defiance. But Stephen and the others knew the truth. It wasn't noble. It was a waste. It was a tantrum by a dying man who couldn't stand the thought of losing control. Back in Jonestown, Hyacinth Thrash, the elderly woman who had hidden under her bed, finally emerged. She walked out of her cottage into the blinding sunlight. She expected to see people working, to hear the breakfast bell. Instead, she saw the carnage. She wandered through the rows of bodies, calling out names, shaking shoulders, hoping someone would wake up. She found her sister, Zipporah, dead on the ground. Hyacinth sat down in the dirt and wailed, a solitary figure in a city of corpses. "I is the unliest one," she cried. The cleanup of Jonestown was a logistical nightmare for the U.S. military, who were called in to retrieve the bodies. It took days. The heat and humidity accelerated the decomposition. The soldiers had to wear masks to block the stench, but it clung to their uniforms, their skin, their memories. They placed the bodies in aluminum transfer cases and flew them back to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. There, the final tragedy played out. Many of the bodies were never claimed. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving no one to collect the remains. Other relatives were too ashamed, or too poor, or too angry to accept the bodies of the people who had drank the Kool-Aid. More than 400 of the victims, mostly children and the elderly, were buried in a mass grave at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California. It stands there today, a somber hillside marker for a community that vanished. The legacy of Jonestown is not just in the numbers. It is in the psychological scar it left on the world. It changed the way we look at charismatic leaders. It changed the way we look at cults. Before Jonestown, people thought of cults as eccentric groups of hippies living in communes. After Jonestown, we understood that they could be weaponized. We understood that the human need for belonging is so powerful that it can override the instinct for self-preservation. Jim Jones didn't use magic. He didn't use hypnosis. He used basic human psychology. He found people who were hurting. He gave them a family. He gave them a purpose. And then, slowly, methodically, he isolated them until he was the only reality they had left. He made them practice their own deaths until the act of dying felt more natural than the act of living. And I will save you is a hook that is still dangling today. You see it in political extremism. You see it in online radicalization. You see it whenever a leader demands absolute loyalty and tells you that the world outside is evil. The mechanics of Jonestown are still with us. For the survivors, the nightmare didn't end when the sun came up. They had to come back to a world that didn't understand. They were called brainwashed. They were called murderers. They had to rebuild their lives from scratch, carrying the guilt of having survived when their children did not. Tim Carter, the man who carried the suitcase, spent years trying to make sense of it. He later said, "I don't believe in closure. You don't get over something like this. You just learn to live with the ghosts." Stephen Jones, the son, struggled with addiction and rage, fighting the shadow of his father before finally finding peace and accepting that he was not his father. He chose to live a life of quiet kindness, the exact opposite of Jones's grandiose narcissism. And what of the site itself? Today the jungle has reclaimed Jonestown. The vines have pulled down the cottages. The pavilion is gone, its wood rotted away by the rain and the insects. If you go there now, there is almost nothing left to see. Just a clearing in the trees and a small memorial marker overgrown with weeds. But if you stand there in the silence, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of a choir singing. The bounce of a basketball. The laughter of children who didn't know they were part of a death pact. And the voice of a man who promised them heaven and gave them a cup of poison. The story of Jonestown is a warning written in blood. It reminds us that no one is immune to the seduction of certainty. We all want to belong. We all want to be saved. But the moment we surrender our critical thought, the moment we hand over our conscience to another human being, we are stepping onto the path that leads to doing its grim work in the jungle. A different kind of drama was playing out 150 miles away in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. To understand the full scope of Jim Jones's madness, you have to understand that his web didn't end at the perimeter of the camp. It stretched into the city, where the People's Temple maintained a headquarters in a house in the Lamaha Gardens district. On that fateful Saturday, the temple's basketball team was in town. These were the young lions of the community, fit, strong, and talented. Among them were Jones's own sons, Stephen, Jim Jr., and Tim. They were there to play a tournament against the Guyanese national team, a PR move designed to show the locals how wholesome and American the temple was. They had played hard, unaware that back home, their father was preparing to end the world. That evening, the team gathered at the Lamaha Gardens house. The mood was strange. Rumors were flying about a shooting at the airstrip. Then, the radio crackled to life. It was a coded message from Jonestown. The voice on the other end was frantic, ordering the Georgetown staff to avenge the temple against its enemies and then commit revolutionary suicide. Stephen Jones, 19 years old, stood by the radio. He was the son of the prophet, but he had seen behind the curtain. He knew his father was addicted to drugs. He knew the miracles were fake. And in that moment, with the static hissing in the humid air, Stephen made a choice that would save their lives. He looked at the others, the young men who had grown up calling Jones Dad, and he refused the order. He told them, "We're not killing anyone, and we're not killing ourselves." It was a mutiny. For the first time, the spell was broken. They realized that the voice on the radio was not the voice of God, but the voice of a dying, desperate man. They sat in that house through the long, terrifying night, holding baseball bats and knives, not to attack, but to defend themselves against the loyalists who might try to enforce the order. They waited for the dawn, wondering if they were the last people left alive on Earth. But in another room of that same house, the indoctrination held firm. Sharon Amos, a fierce, high-ranking loyalist who worked in the temple's public relations office, heard the order and didn't hesitate. She believed. She believed that the fascists were coming. She believed that death was the only escape. She took a large kitchen knife and ushered her 3 children into the bathroom. Leanne was 21. Krista was 11. Martin was 10. Imagine the scene behind that locked door. The tile floor, the harsh light, the sound of water running to drown out the noise. Sharon Amos didn't hate her children. In her twisted reality, she loved them so much she wanted to save them from the enemies her leader had invented. She killed Krista and Martin first. Then, she and her eldest daughter, Leanne, killed each other. When the police arrived later, they found them in a tangle of blood on the bathroom floor. It was a microcosm of the massacre, the ultimate proof that the poison wasn't just in the flavor aid.
Days and weeks
it was in
followed.
the survivors, the basketball team, the defectors from the airstrip, the few who escaped into the jungle, were thrust into a new nightmare. They were flown back to the United States, but they didn't return as victims. They returned as pariahs. The media was in a frenzy. The headlines screamed, "Cult of Death." The public couldn't understand. How could mothers kill their babies? How could intelligent people follow a madman? The survivors were viewed with suspicion and fear. There were rumors of hit squads, secret sleeper cells of temple members known as Angels of Death, who were waiting to assassinate the defectors and finish what Jones started. Tim Carter, who had escaped with the suitcase, lived in terror. He checked under his car for bombs every morning. He slept with a gun. The survivors were isolated, unable to explain their grief to a world that saw them as monsters or fools. They had lost their entire families, spouses, children, parents, and yet the world told them they were lucky. The psychological toll was devastating. This is what experts call moral injury. It wasn't just that they had survived trauma. It was that their entire moral compass had been shattered. They had given their labor, their money, and their loyalty to a man who had used it to build a graveyard. They had to rebuild their sense of reality from scratch. Years later, Stephen Jones would speak about the legacy of his father. He didn't demonize him, nor did he excuse him. He spoke about the danger of giving away your power. "My father was a mirror," he said. He reflected back to people what they wanted to see. Terrifying lesson of Jonestown. It wasn't about the jungle. It wasn't about the isolation. It was about the human desire to be taken care of. Jim Jones found people who felt small, people who felt unheard, people who were crushed by racism and poverty, and he told them, "I will be your father. I will take the weight off your shoulders." And it felt good. That is the seductive part of the poison. It feels good to belong. It feels good to have certainty in a chaotic world. It feels good to think you are building a utopia. The people of Jonestown were not stupid. They were idealists. They were people who wanted to make the world better. They built a school. They built a medical clinic. They sang songs about justice. But screw by screw, compromise by compromise, they gave up their autonomy. First, it was just 10% of their income. Then it was all of it. First, it was just listening to a sermon. Then it was confessing their sins. Then it was practicing suicide. By the time the vat of poison was brought out to the pavilion, they had no self left to fight back with. The tragedy of Jonestown is not just that 918 people died. The tragedy is that they died for a lie, believing it was the truth. Today, the site of Jonestown is overgrown. The jungle is aggressive. It consumes everything. If you go there now, you have to hack through vines to find the concrete slab where the pavilion once stood. There are no ghosts there, only the hum of insects and the cry of tropical birds. But the ghosts are here, among us. They are in the warning signs we ignore. They are in the politicians who demand absolute loyalty. They are in the online groups that tell us the world is evil and only we know the truth. They are in every leader who claims that only they can fix it. He died a coward, shot in the head while his people suffered the agony of cyanide. But the mechanism he used, the manipulation of faith, the exploitation of fear, the weaponization of belonging, is very much alive. As we look back at the aerial footage of those colorful bodies scattered like fallen leaves across the Guyanese soil, we must remember not just how they died, but how they lived. We must remember Christine Miller, who stood up and said, "No." We must remember the basketball team who chose life. We must remember that even in the darkest dark there is a choice. The hook is always there, waiting in the water, baited with the promise of salvation. The question is, will we recognize the poison before we drink it? Over 900 people died, not because of war but because they trusted one man. And the tragedy is, they were good people. They were looking for a better world. They just followed the wrong map, and by the time they realized where it led, they were already home.